In 20 years investigating domestic crimes, I've never seen planning this sinister. December 22nd, 2023. Gary expected romance when Dana promised lingerie and passion. Instead, she tied him in darkness and severed his manhood with surgical precision. While he bled, begging for help, his own family refused to call 911. Dana photographed everything, shared it with his contacts, then flushed the evidence to prevent reattachment. But what drove this calculated revenge? Subscribe to the channel, because cases like Gary's reveal how psychological manipulation can escalate to unthinkable violence before we even recognize the warning signs. December 22nd, 2023. The kind of winter evening that should have been filled with Christmas lights and warm embraces. Instead, in the quiet suburban town of Millfield, California, something unspeakable was about to unfold behind the closed doors of a modest ranch house on Maple Street. What happened that night would shatter every assumption about love, betrayal, and the thin line between devotion and destruction. It was the kind of case that makes even seasoned investigators pause, take a deep breath, and wonder how far human beings can fall when love turns to rage. The woman had been planning it, not for days or weeks, but with the kind of methodical precision that comes from months of festering resentment. She believed her husband was a cheater, a betrayer of the sacred trust they had built together. And on that December night, she decided to take from him something that could never be replaced, never be healed, never be forgotten. In one swift, calculated moment, she would sever not just flesh and bone, but any hope of the life they had once shared. The act itself was brutal in its finality. With surgical precision born of pure fury, she removed her husband's manhood entirely, discarding it where it would never be found again. Gone, vanished, as if it had never existed at all. But this isn't just a story about a moment of violence. This is about the man who survived it. The man who had to wake up the next morning and face a reality so altered, so fundamentally changed, that most people couldn't even imagine it. How do you rebuild a life when everything that defined your identity as a man has been stolen from you in a single night? His name was Gary, and against all odds, he found the courage to tell his story. I've been investigating crimes for more than 2 decades, and I've seen things that would keep most people awake at night. But when I first heard about what happened in Millfield, even I had to sit down. This wasn't just assault. This wasn't just domestic violence. This was something else entirely. Something that reaches into the darkest corners of human psychology and asks questions that none of us want to answer. The call came in just after midnight. A woman had driven herself to the emergency room at Riverside County Hospital, claiming she had just defended herself against an abusive husband. But when the police arrived at the address she gave them, they found Gary bleeding out on his bathroom floor, barely conscious, his life hanging by a thread that was growing thinner with each passing second. What they discovered that night would haunt the responding officers for years to come. And what Gary would eventually tell us about the 2 years leading up to that December evening would reveal a pattern of psychological manipulation so intricate, so carefully constructed, that it makes you wonder how many other relationships are teetering on the edge of similar explosions. Gary was 39 years old when it happened, a working man, the kind of guy you'd see at any gas station in America, filling up your tank with a tired smile and a polite nod. He pumped gas for a living at Thompson's Shell station on the outskirts of town, and when things got tight, he'd drive for rideshare apps in the evenings. Nothing glamorous, but honest work. The kind of work that builds calluses on your hands and teaches you the value of every dollar. He wasn't the type you'd expect to find at the center of a story like this. Gary had always been a relationship man, the kind of guy who believed in partnership, in building something lasting with someone special. His track record proved it. 11 years with his first wife, Karen. 6 years with his second, Brenda, who had given him his daughter, the light of his life. Both marriages had ended amicably, or as amicably as any divorce can end. No restraining orders, no police reports, no history of violence or abuse. Just 2 relationships that had run their course, resolved through lawyers and paperwork, and the kind of mature conversations that adults have when they realize they've grown apart. When Gary met Dana through social media in 2022, he thought he had learned enough about love to recognize the real thing when he saw it. She was 34, beautiful in that understated way that catches your attention without trying too hard. A mother of 2 boys, 18 and 8, who seemed to have her life together despite the challenges of raising children from previous relationships. Their first conversations were careful, tentative. Both had been hurt before. Both knew the weight of failed relationships and broken promises. Dana had specifically told Gary that she wasn't looking to rush into anything serious. She had suffered through her share of heartbreak, she explained, and wanted to take things slowly this time. And at first, that's exactly what they did. The early months of their relationship felt healthy, normal even. They would spend time together on weekends, introduce each other to their children gradually, build the foundation of trust that any lasting relationship requires. Gary's daughter seemed to like Dana well enough, and Dana's boys were polite, respectful kids who welcomed Gary into their home without drama or resentment. But then, something shifted. Something subtle at first, so gradual that Gary didn't recognize it as a warning sign until it was far too late. Dana's friends would later tell investigators something that should have been a red flag from the beginning. They said Dana had never been jealous in her previous relationships, never possessive, never controlling. With her ex-husbands, she had been almost indifferent, the kind of woman who trusted her partners completely or simply didn't care enough to worry about what they were doing when she wasn't around. But with Gary, everything was different. The intensity of her feelings surprised even her closest friends. It was as if Gary had awakened something in Dana that had been dormant for years, something that grew stronger and more demanding with each passing month. The jealousy started small. A comment here, a question there. If Gary was scrolling through his phone and a video popped up featuring an attractive woman, Dana would immediately tense up. Why was he looking at that? Did he think that woman was prettier than her? Why couldn't he just change the channel? It escalated quickly. Soon, Gary found himself walking on eggshells every time they watched television together. If a movie featured a love scene, if a commercial showed a woman in a bikini, if even the news happened to include footage of an attractive female reporter, Dana would explode into accusations and demands. To keep the peace, Gary started avoiding anything that might trigger her jealousy. He deleted apps from his phone. He changed the channel during certain commercials. He learned to anticipate her reactions and adjust his behavior accordingly, always trying to stay one step ahead of the next argument. The irony wasn't lost on him. For the first time in his adult life, Gary was in a relationship where he had absolutely nothing to hide, where his phone was an open book and his daily routine was completely transparent. Dana knew his passwords, checked his messages regularly, and had access to every corner of his digital life. Yet somehow that complete transparency only seemed to fuel her suspicions. Gary had worked hard to build trust with Dana. When he got her a job at the sandwich shop inside his gas station, he thought it would help. They could ride to work together, spend their breaks together, return home together at the end of each shift. No gaps in time where her imagination could run wild. No opportunities for misunderstandings or secret encounters. But even that wasn't enough. Even when they were literally working side by side, Dana found reasons to doubt him, reasons to question his loyalty, reasons to believe that somehow, somewhere, Gary was betraying her trust. The pattern was always the same. Dana would find something suspicious, usually something completely innocent that her mind would twist into evidence of infidelity. A phone number in his contacts without a name attached. A female customer who smiled a little too warmly when Gary filled her tank. A conversation with a co-worker that lasted 30 seconds longer than Dana thought appropriate. She would confront him immediately, her voice rising with each accusation, her questions coming faster than Gary could answer them. And Gary, desperate to keep the peace, would bend over backward to explain, to reassure, to prove his innocence in whatever crime his girlfriend's imagination had conjured up. What Gary didn't understand yet was that this wasn't really about trust. This was about control. And with each successful confrontation, with each time Gary rearranged his life to accommodate Dana's jealousy, that control grew stronger. By the winter of 2023, their relationship had become a carefully choreographed dance around Dana's insecurities. Gary had learned to anticipate her triggers, to modify his behavior preemptively, to live his life in a way that prioritized her comfort over his own freedom. He told himself it was love. He told himself that all relationships required compromise. He had no way of knowing that Dana's need for control was about to evolve into something far more dangerous than jealousy, something that would culminate in an act so violent, so irreversible, that it would destroy both of their lives in a single moment of rage. The warning signs were all there, scattered across 24 months of increasingly possessive behavior. But Gary, like so many victims of psychological manipulation, had learned to normalize the abnormal, to accept the unacceptable, to believe that love was supposed to hurt sometimes. What happened on December 22nd didn't occur in a vacuum. It was the inevitable conclusion of a relationship that had been spiraling toward disaster from the moment Dana realized that her feelings for Gary were unlike anything she had ever experienced before. And Gary, the man who survived what no man should ever have to survive, would soon discover that the worst part wasn't the physical trauma. The worst part was learning to live with the knowledge that the woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted with his life, had been capable of something so calculating, so brutal, so final. But that night was still in the future. In those early months of 2022, Gary still believed he had found something special. He still believed that love could conquer jealousy, that patience could heal insecurity, that dedication could build the kind of relationship that lasts forever. He had no idea that he was dating his own destruction. The first time Dana showed Gary exactly how far she was willing to go to maintain control, it was over something as innocent as a phone number saved in his contacts, a number without a name attached. The kind of digital breadcrumb that accumulates in everyone's phone, usually forgotten the moment after it's entered. But for Dana, that unnamed contact was evidence of betrayal, proof of deception, a smoking gun in a crime that existed only in her imagination. They were leaving work together that evening, driving home from Thompson's Shell station where they both worked their shifts side by side. Gary was behind the wheel, exhausted after 8 hours of pumping gas and making small talk with customers. Dana was scrolling through his phone, as had become her routine. She had memorized every contact, every app, every photo stored in that device. Gary's digital life had become as familiar to her as her own. When she found the number, her voice changed instantly. The casual conversation they had been having about dinner plans evaporated, replaced by the sharp edge of accusation that Gary had learned to recognize and dread. "What's this number?" she demanded, holding the phone inches from his face while he was trying to navigate traffic. Gary glanced at the screen, genuinely confused. It was just a series of digits, no name, no context. The kind of contact that could have been saved for any number of reasons. Maybe someone needed a quick money transfer through one of those apps. Maybe a customer had given him their information for something work-related. In the digital age, phone numbers accumulate like dust, meaningless and forgotten. "I don't know," Gary said honestly. "I'll check when we get home if you want." But honesty wasn't what Dana was looking for. She wanted immediate answers, complete explanations, total transparency about every aspect of Gary's existence. The idea that he couldn't instantly account for every piece of information in his phone was unacceptable. "You have to know," she insisted, her voice rising to that familiar pitch that meant an explosion was coming. "How can you not know whose number this is?" Gary tried to stay calm, tried to be reasonable. "Look, I save numbers for all kinds of reasons. Work stuff, customers, whatever. When we get home, I'll call it and find out, okay?" But Dana was already past the point of rational discussion. The jealousy that her friends said had never existed in her previous relationships was now consuming her completely. In her mind, that anonymous number represented everything she feared most. Another woman, a secret relationship, evidence that Gary was exactly like every other man who had ever betrayed her trust. Without warning, she rolled down the passenger window and hurled Gary's phone into the street. The device, which Gary had purchased just 2 months earlier and was still paying off in monthly installments, shattered against the asphalt. 2 months of payments down the drain. 22 more payments still to go on a phone that was now electronic confetti scattered across a suburban road. Gary pulled over immediately, staring at the spot where his phone had landed. The financial impact hit him first. He was a working-class guy, a gas station attendant who drove for ride-share apps to make ends meet. That phone represented hours of labor, weeks of careful budgeting. It wasn't just a device to him. It was a tool he needed for work, for staying connected with his daughter, for the basic functionality of modern life. "You're crazy," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I told you I'd figure out whose number it was when we got home. You didn't have to do that." But Dana wasn't finished. Even as Gary's phone lay destroyed in the street, she was already planning her next move. Before throwing the device out the window, She had memorized that mysterious number, copying it into her own phone. She was going to call it herself, she announced. She was going to get to the bottom of this supposed betrayal, whether Gary cooperated or not. What Gary didn't understand in that moment was that the phone wasn't really the issue. The mysterious number wasn't really the issue. This was about establishing dominance, about testing boundaries, about seeing exactly how much control she could exert over Gary's life before he finally pushed back. And Gary's response told her everything she needed to know. He was frustrated, yes, annoyed about the financial loss, certainly, but he didn't leave. He didn't demand that she replace his phone. He didn't recognize the incident for what it was, a preview of the escalating psychological abuse that would define the next 2 years of his life. Later, investigators would identify this moment as a crucial turning point in their relationship. Dana had learned that she could destroy Gary's property, cost him money he couldn't afford to lose, and face no real consequences. Gary had learned to accept the unacceptable, to normalize behavior that should have sent him running. But Gary was a man who had always believed in the power of patience and understanding. In his previous marriages, conflicts had been resolved through communication and compromise. He assumed that Dana's jealousy was something they could work through together, a temporary challenge that would fade as their trust deepened. He was wrong. The pattern of control was just beginning, and Dana was learning that Gary was the perfect victim for the kind of psychological manipulation she was unconsciously developing. He was too trusting to be suspicious, too committed to be easily deterred, too decent to recognize the depths of deception that were possible in a romantic relationship. Gary was also a man who had never experienced the kind of possessive intensity that Dana brought to their relationship. In his previous marriages, he had been free to maintain friendships, enjoy his hobbies, make independent decisions about how he spent his time. He had always been what he called a partnership guy, someone who preferred shared activities over solitary pursuits, but who had never felt the need to account for every moment of his existence. With Dana, that freedom evaporated gradually, so slowly that Gary didn't notice the walls closing in until it was too late to escape without a fight. The drinking became another battlefield. Gary wasn't an alcoholic, wasn't even a heavy drinker by most standards. He was a social drinker, the kind of guy who might have a beer or two at a barbecue, who enjoyed relaxing with a cold beverage after a long day at work. In his previous relationships, this had never been an issue. His ex-wives had occasionally joined him, sometimes abstained, but never made his moderate alcohol consumption a source of conflict. Dana saw it differently. Every beer Gary drank was a potential threat to her control, a sign that he was prioritizing his own pleasure over her comfort. She began setting limits, making rules, expressing disapproval whenever Gary showed any interest in having a drink. At first, Gary tried to accommodate her concerns. If Dana didn't want him drinking at her house, he would stop by a bar on his way over and have a beer before he arrived. Problem solved, he thought. He could still enjoy a drink occasionally, and Dana wouldn't have to watch him do it. But Dana didn't see this as a reasonable compromise. She saw it as sneaky behavior, evidence that Gary was hiding things from her, proof that he cared more about alcohol than about her feelings. When he arrived at her house after having a drink, she would immediately accuse him of trying to deceive her, of prioritizing his addiction over their relationship. "You came here drunk," she would say, even when Gary had consumed nothing more than a single beer with dinner. "You're choosing alcohol over me." Gary found himself caught in an impossible situation. If he drank in front of Dana, she would become upset and accusatory. If he drank before seeing Dana, she would accuse him of being sneaky and deceptive. The only acceptable option from Dana's perspective was for Gary to stop drinking entirely. And gradually, that's exactly what happened. Gary gave up his occasional beers, his social drinks, his simple pleasure of relaxing with a cold beverage after work. It was easier than fighting about it, he told himself. It was a small sacrifice to make for the sake of their relationship. But each compromise Gary made only emboldened Dana to demand more. Each boundary he allowed her to cross made the next violation seem less significant. Each time he chose peace over principle, he was teaching Dana that she could reshape his entire life to match her vision of what their relationship should be. The physical violence, when it finally came, wasn't from Dana herself. It came from her sister, Rebecca, during an argument that escalated beyond anything Gary had experienced in his previous relationships. They had been living together for about 4 months when it happened. Dana's sister was staying with them temporarily, sleeping on their couch while she got back on her feet after a move from another state. Gary had been patient with the arrangement, understanding that families sometimes needed help, even when it meant less privacy and more household tension. The fight started over something trivial, as these fights always did. Dana wanted to go out with her sister, and Gary had expressed some mild frustration about her always wanting to include Rebecca in their plans. He wasn't being unreasonable, wasn't trying to control Dana's relationships with her family. He was simply pointing out that maybe occasionally they could spend time together without having to accommodate a third person. But Dana heard criticism where Gary intended conversation. She heard control where Gary intended compromise. And when she became defensive, Rebecca immediately jumped to her sister's defense. The argument escalated quickly. Voices were raised, accusations were made, and suddenly Gary found himself facing not one angry woman, but 2. Dana and Rebecca were both shouting at him, both advancing toward him in the confined space of the living room, both treating him like an enemy who had invaded their home. Gary tried to de-escalate the situation, tried to step back and create some physical distance, but Rebecca was beyond reason, beyond conversation. She grabbed a broom handle that was leaning against the kitchen wall and swung it at Gary's face with the full force of her rage. The blow caught Gary directly in the eye, the wooden handle connecting with enough force to send him staggering backward. The pain was immediate and intense, but the shock was even worse. He had never been hit by a woman before, had never been in a physical altercation in his own home, had never imagined that a simple disagreement could escalate to violence so quickly. As Gary held his injured eye, trying to process what had just happened, he waited for Dana to intervene. Surely she would be horrified that her sister had attacked her boyfriend. Surely she would demand an apology, insist that Rebecca leave their home immediately, take some kind of action to protect the man she claimed to love. But Dana's reaction was not what Gary expected. She didn't comfort him. She didn't confront her sister. She didn't even seem particularly surprised by what had happened. Instead, she continued arguing, as if Gary getting struck in the face with a broom handle was just another part of their domestic dispute. It was Dana's other sister, Michelle, and her husband who finally intervened. They had arrived in the middle of the chaos and immediately recognized that the situation had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They separated the combatants, sent Rebecca to cool off and tried to restore some semblance of order to the household. But the damage was done. Gary's eye was swelling shut, darkening to a deep purple that would take weeks to fade. More importantly, something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what his life with Dana really was. Gary packed his belongings that night and went home to his parents' house. For the first time since he had started dating Dana, he had some distance from the relationship, some perspective on what had become his daily reality. His parents saw his black eye and asked what had happened. When Gary explained the situation, he could see the concern in their faces, the recognition that their son was involved in something unhealthy and potentially dangerous. For 15 days, Gary stayed away from Dana. For 15 days, he had a chance to remember what it felt like to live without constant scrutiny, without jealous accusations, without the exhausting effort of managing someone else's insecurities. He could watch television without worrying about what images might appear on the screen. He could check his phone without having to explain every contact and every message. He could exist as himself rather than as the carefully modified version of himself that Dana required. But Dana wasn't willing to let him go that easily. After 2 weeks of silence, she called him, her voice breaking with tears and desperation. She missed him, she said. She needed him. She promised that things would be different, that she would work on her jealousy, that they could build the kind of relationship they both wanted. And Gary, despite everything that had happened, despite the black eye that was still fading and the clear evidence that his relationship with Dana was toxic, found himself wavering. Because the truth was, he missed her too. Between the fights and the jealousy and the psychological manipulation, there had been good moments. There had been affection and intimacy, and the kind of connection that made him believe their problems could be solved. Gary was also a man who hated to give up on relationships. He had been married twice before, and both divorces had been painful, expensive, emotionally devastating experiences that he didn't want to repeat. He believed in working through problems, in finding solutions, in giving people second chances to become better versions of themselves. When Dana promised to change, Gary wanted to believe her. When she said she recognized that her jealousy was a problem, he thought maybe she was finally ready to address it. When she begged him to come back, he convinced himself that her desperation was evidence of genuine love rather than possessive control. So Gary returned to Dana's house on Maple Street. He moved back in with her and her two boys, back into the routine of shared work shifts and supervised phone usage, and carefully managed social interactions. He told himself that the incident with Rebecca was an aberration, a one-time explosion that wouldn't be repeated. But moving back in with Dana also meant sharing a wall with Rebecca, who lived in the attached house next door. The woman who had hit him with a broom handle was now his neighbor, visible through the kitchen window, audible through the thin walls that separated their homes. Gary never spoke to Rebecca again after that night, but her presence was a constant reminder of how quickly his supposedly loving relationship could turn violent. The house itself became another symbol of Gary's diminishing independence. He had moved into Dana's space, into a home where she made the rules and controlled the environment. He was paying rent, contributing to household expenses, but he had no real authority over how that household was run. He was a guest in his own relationship, allowed to stay as long as he followed Dana's increasingly complex set of expectations and boundaries. Living with Dana also meant living with her two children, which brought its own complications and challenges. The 18-year-old was old enough to recognize the tension between his mother and her boyfriend, old enough to understand that the relationship was far from healthy. The 8-year-old was more accepting, more adaptable, but also more vulnerable to the psychological atmosphere that Dana's jealousy created in their home. Gary found himself walking on eggshells, not just around Dana, but around her entire family structure. Every interaction was potentially problematic, every conversation a possible source of conflict. He was living in a house where he was simultaneously essential and unwelcome, needed and resented, loved and controlled. But Gary had spent 49 years learning to adapt to challenging situations, to find ways to make relationships work, despite their problems. He had survived 2 divorces, raised a daughter, built a career from honest labor. He believed that patience and commitment could overcome any obstacle, that love was worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless. What Gary didn't understand was that he wasn't fighting for love. He was fighting for the illusion of love, the possibility of love, the memory of what love had felt like before Dana's psychological manipulation had twisted it into something unrecognizable. And Dana, emboldened by Gary's return, by his willingness to forgive violence and accept control, was already planning the next phase of their relationship. She had learned that Gary would tolerate almost anything in the name of keeping peace. She had learned that she could push him to the very edge of his endurance and he would still come back, still hope for something better, still believe in the possibility of happiness. But she hadn't learned the most important lesson of all, that there are some lines that once crossed can never be uncrossed. Some acts that, once committed, change everything forever. December 22nd, 2023 was still months away, but the psychological foundation for what would happen that night was already being laid brick by brick, compromise by compromise, in the modest house on Maple Street where Gary was learning to live as a prisoner in his own relationship. As experienced investigators know, the most devastating crimes often begin with the smallest compromises. A boundary crossed, a principle abandoned, a moment when someone who thought they knew themselves discovers they were capable of something they never imagined possible. For Gary, that moment came when he made a decision that would not only destroy his relationship with Dana, but would reveal a darkness within himself that he had never acknowledged. It was a choice that would transform him from victim to perpetrator, from someone deserving sympathy to someone whose actions demanded consequences. The truth about what led to December 22nd is more complex than simple domestic violence, more disturbing than straightforward jealousy. What happened that night was the culmination of a psychological storm that had been building for months, involving not just Gary and Dana, but a third person whose presence would prove to be the final catalyst in a relationship already spiraling toward destruction. Her name was Sarah, and she was 15 years old. Sarah was Dana's adopted niece, though the family relationships were complicated in the way that many blended families become when tragedy and necessity force people together. She had been raised by Dana's sister Michelle since she was 7 or 8 years old. after her biological parents proved unable or unwilling to care for her properly. From the beginning of Gary's relationship with Dana, Sarah had been a source of tension. Dana didn't trust her, didn't want her in their home, didn't believe that a teenage girl could be around adult men without causing problems. It was a suspicion that seemed rooted in Dana's own insecurities, her own fears about loyalty and betrayal, rather than any actual behavior from Sarah herself. "That girl is trouble," Dana would tell Gary whenever Sarah's name came up in conversation. "She doesn't respect boundaries. She doesn't care if a man is married or taken. If she wants something, she'll go after it." Gary had initially dismissed these warnings as more evidence of Dana's paranoid jealousy. Sarah was just a child, barely a teenager when he first met her. The idea that Dana could be jealous of her own teenage niece seemed absurd. Another symptom of the psychological issues that were already poisoning their relationship. But Dana's concerns about Sarah weren't entirely unfounded. The teenager was struggling with issues that went far beyond normal adolescent rebellion. She had been acting out in increasingly serious ways, testing boundaries with her adoptive mother, engaging in behaviors that suggested deeper psychological problems stemming from her early childhood trauma. Michelle, Sarah's adoptive mother, had reached the breaking point. She had taken Sarah to doctors, therapists, counselors. She had tried structure and discipline, patience and understanding. Nothing seemed to work. The girl was becoming increasingly defiant, increasingly unpredictable, increasingly dangerous to herself and others. There had been incidents, physical altercations between Sarah and Michelle, concerns about inappropriate relationships with older individuals, suspicions about pregnancy that had required medical intervention, the kind of crisis situations that push families beyond their capacity to cope. Michelle had even contacted child services, exploring the possibility of disrupting the adoption entirely. After years of trying to help Sarah heal from her early trauma, Michelle was beginning to accept that she might not be equipped to handle the level of intervention that Sarah required. Into this volatile situation stepped Gary, a man whose own psychological defenses had been systematically dismantled by 2 years of emotional abuse. His sense of right and wrong had been eroded by constant gaslighting. His ability to make healthy decisions had been compromised by months of walking on eggshells around Dana's explosive jealousy. Gary had agreed to help with childcare occasionally, picking up Sarah and his own daughter from school and dropping them off at Michelle's house while Dana worked her shifts at the sandwich shop. It was a practical arrangement that solved a logistical problem for both families while keeping Sarah out of Dana's home, where her presence would have caused immediate conflict. At first, these interactions were completely innocent. Gary was simply a family friend providing transportation, a responsible adult helping to supervise children after school. Sarah was polite, well-behaved in his presence, nothing like the troubled teenager that Dana and Michelle described in their more frustrated moments. But when Sarah acquired a smartphone, the dynamics changed completely. Social media became the bridge between Gary's world and Sarah's world. The 15-year-old girl, hungry for adult attention and validation, reached out through Instagram and text messaging to the one adult male in her extended family who hadn't yet written her off as hopeless. The conversations began innocently enough. Sarah would ask about school pickup times, share photos of her day, engage in the kind of casual social media interaction that defines teenage communication in the digital age. Gary, feeling sympathetic toward a girl who seemed to be struggling with family problems, responded with the same friendly attention he might give to any young person in his extended social circle. But Sarah was not just any young person. She was a traumatized teenager with poor boundaries and a history of seeking inappropriate relationships with older men. And Gary, despite his good intentions, was a man whose judgment had been severely compromised by his toxic relationship with Dana. The conversations gradually became more personal. Sarah began confiding in Gary about her problems at home, her conflicts with Michelle, her feelings of being misunderstood and unwanted. Gary, recognizing some of his own feelings of being controlled and criticized, felt a sense of connection with the teenager's struggles. And then Sarah began sharing information about her relationships with other men, older men, adult men who were engaging with a 15-year-old girl in ways that any responsible adult should have recognized as completely inappropriate. This should have been the moment when Gary contacted authorities, when he reported the information about adults who were potentially exploiting a minor. This should have been the moment when his protective instincts as a father kicked in, when he recognized that Sarah needed help, not enablement. Instead, Gary made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of protecting Sarah, Gary became another adult who was willing to exploit her vulnerability. Instead of reporting the inappropriate relationships she described, he became part of the pattern of exploitation. Instead of maintaining appropriate boundaries with a troubled teenager, he allowed himself to cross lines that should never be crossed. The details of what followed are difficult to discuss, even for someone who has investigated countless cases of abuse and exploitation. Gary, a 39-year-old man, began engaging in sexually explicit conversations with a 15-year-old girl. He requested and received inappropriate images. He arranged secret meetings. Gary would later try to minimize his actions, to suggest that Sarah was mature for her age, to imply that she was the instigator of their inappropriate relationship. These are the classic justifications that adult predators use to rationalize their exploitation of minors. They are excuses that investigators hear in case after case, justifications that never make the fundamental crime any less serious. The truth is simpler and more damning. Gary was an adult who chose to sexually exploit a vulnerable teenager. Whatever psychological pressure he was experiencing in his relationship with Dana, whatever emotional manipulation he had endured, whatever boundaries had been eroded in his own life, none of that justified his decision to victimize a child. For approximately 1 month, Gary engaged in what he would euphemistically describe as a relationship with Sarah. In reality, he was committing statutory rape, exploiting a minor and adding another layer of trauma to the life of a girl who had already suffered more than any child should endure. Gary took elaborate precautions to hide his criminal behavior from Dana, deleting messages, using secret communication apps, coordinating alibis and cover stories. The same careful attention to digital security that had once been about avoiding Dana's jealous outbursts was now being used to conceal felony crimes against a child. But secrets of this magnitude are almost impossible to maintain indefinitely, and Gary's secret was about to be discovered by the one person whose psychological instability had already proven capable of explosive violence. Dana, the woman who had thrown his phone out a car window over an anonymous contact number, was about to learn that her boyfriend was sexually involved with her 15-year-old niece. What happened next would make everything that had come before seem like a minor disagreement between lovers. Dana's jealousy, which had already destroyed Gary's property and isolated him from friends and family, was about to evolve into something far more dangerous than psychological manipulation. On December 22, 2023, Dana would discover evidence of Gary's betrayal, and her response would be swift, brutal, and irreversible. The investigation into what happened that night would eventually reveal the full scope of Gary's criminal behavior with Sarah. Law enforcement would uncover the text messages, the photographs, the evidence of sexual contact between an adult and a minor. Gary would face charges that could result in decades in prison, consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. But before any of that legal reckoning could occur, Gary would face a different kind of justice, personal justice. The kind of revenge that comes from a woman who has discovered that the man she loved, the man she controlled, the man she had reshaped to fit her vision of the perfect partner, had betrayed her in the most fundamental way possible. Dana's response to Gary's betrayal would be methodical, calculated, and devastating. She would take from Gary something that could never be replaced, never be healed, never be forgotten. And Gary, the man who had survived 2 years of psychological abuse, who had endured violence from Dana's family, who had compromised his own values and boundaries in pursuit of a peaceful relationship, would discover that some actions have consequences that extend far beyond legal punishment. Some actions change everything forever. December 22nd was coming, and with it a reckoning that neither Gary nor Dana could have imagined when they first met through social media 2 years earlier. A reckoning that would transform both of their lives in ways that would echo for decades to come. The stage was set for a crime that would shock even experienced investigators, a crime that would raise questions about justice, revenge, and the terrible mathematics of retribution that govern human relationships when love turns to rage. In criminal investigations, there's a concept called the point of no return. It's the moment when a series of bad decisions, accumulated over time, suddenly converges into an unstoppable cascade of consequences. Everything that happens after that moment feels inevitable, as if the participants are simply acting out a script that was written by their previous choices. For Gary and Dana, December 21st, 2023, became that point of no return. Gary had become meticulous about covering his tracks during his month-long inappropriate relationship with Sarah. He deleted messages immediately after reading them. He used apps that automatically erased conversations. He coached the 15-year-old girl on digital security, teaching her how to hide evidence of their criminal communication from the adults who were supposed to be protecting her. It was a level of operational security that would have impressed cybercrime investigators if it hadn't been deployed in service of exploiting a child. Gary approached his predatory behavior with the same careful attention to detail that he brought to his work, the same methodical planning that had once made him a reliable employee and trustworthy partner. But for all his precautions, Gary had overlooked one critical vulnerability. He was dealing with a traumatized teenager whose emotional instability was exactly what made her vulnerable to exploitation in the first place. Sarah had been spiraling for months before Gary entered her life. The behavioral problems that had pushed her adoptive mother Michelle to the breaking point weren't improving. They were getting worse. Sarah was acting out in increasingly dangerous ways, testing boundaries with adults, seeking validation through risky behaviors that frightened everyone around her. The inappropriate relationship with Gary was just one part of a larger pattern of self-destructive choices that Sarah was making in her desperate attempt to feel valued, wanted, important to someone. She was collecting adult male attention like other teenagers collect social media likes, using her sexuality as currency in transactions she was too young to understand. And like many teenagers, Sarah was also remarkably careless about digital security when her emotions were involved. On the evening of December 21st, 2023, that carelessness would finally catch up to both her and Gary. The elaborate precautions they had taken to hide their relationship would prove worthless against a basic parental supervision that neither of them had anticipated. Michelle's husband, David, had been growing increasingly concerned about Sarah's behavior for weeks. The girl was staying out late, being secretive about her activities, displaying the kind of warning signs that every responsible guardian learns to recognize. David suspected that Sarah was involved with older men again, but he hadn't been able to prove it. When Sarah left her phone unattended that evening, David saw an opportunity to finally get some answers about what was happening in the teenager's life. Modern parenting in the digital age often requires exactly this kind of monitoring, especially when dealing with a child who has already demonstrated poor judgment about online safety. What David found when he accessed Sarah's phone went far beyond his worst fears. The messages between Sarah and Gary painted a picture of an adult man systematically grooming and exploiting a vulnerable teenager. The conversations revealed not just inappropriate communication, but evidence of sexual contact, exchanges of explicit images, and plans for future meetings. It was exactly the kind of predatory behavior that destroys families and sends adults to prison for decades. David's first instinct was to contact his wife Michelle immediately. This was the kind of crisis that required both parents to be involved, the kind of situation that would require careful coordination with law enforcement and child protective services. Sarah was in immediate danger, and Gary was a criminal who needed to be stopped before he could harm other children. But Michelle urged caution. She wanted to gather more evidence before involving authorities. She wanted to understand the full scope of what had been happening. She wanted to make sure they handled the situation in a way that would protect Sarah, while ensuring that Gary faced appropriate consequences for his crimes. It was a reasonable approach under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances because Michelle and David had overlooked one crucial factor: Dana's explosive jealousy and history of violence. David made the decision to confront Dana directly, believing that she had a right to know what her boyfriend was doing behind her back. In retrospect, it was a decision that would set in motion the events of December 22nd, but at the time, it seemed like the responsible thing to do. David approached Dana's house that evening, carrying Sarah's phone as evidence of Gary's betrayal. He knocked on the door around 9 o'clock, his face grim with the knowledge of what he was about to reveal. Dana answered the door expecting a routine neighborly interaction. Instead, she found herself face to face with her brother-in-law. who was holding undeniable proof that the man she loved, the man she had controlled and shaped and molded to fit her vision of the perfect partner, had been betraying her in the most fundamental way possible. "You need to see this," David told her, holding up the phone. "It's about Gary and Sarah." The first time David showed Dana the messages, he couldn't unlock the phone to display the full conversations. Sarah had enabled security features that required biometric or passcode access, and David hadn't yet figured out how to bypass them. He could only show Dana glimpses of the message notifications, fragments of conversations that hinted at something inappropriate without revealing the full scope of Gary's crimes. But even those fragments were enough to trigger Dana's rage. Her worst fears, the jealous fantasies that had tortured her for 2 years, were suddenly revealed to be not paranoid delusions, but actual reality. Gary was cheating on her. Gary was involved with another woman. Gary had been lying to her face while carrying on a secret relationship behind her back. The fact that the other woman was her 15-year-old niece only amplified Dana's fury. This wasn't just adultery. It was betrayal involving her own family. This wasn't just deception. It was criminal exploitation of a child she was supposed to protect. Dana's immediate impulse was violence. She demanded that David take her to confront Sarah immediately, to drag the girl out of whatever hiding place she had found and make her answer for her role in this betrayal. The same rage that had once motivated her to throw Gary's phone out a car window was now focused on a traumatized teenager who had been victimized by an adult predator. David managed to talk Dana down from that initial impulse, but only temporarily. He convinced her to return to Michelle's house, where they could access the full conversations and understand exactly what had been happening between Gary and Sarah. What they found when Sarah was forced to unlock her phone was worse than anything Dana had imagined. The conversations revealed months of inappropriate contact, sexual exploitation, and emotional manipulation. They showed Gary coaching Sarah on how to hide their relationship, encouraging her to delete evidence, teaching her to lie to the adults who were trying to protect her. For Dana, reading those messages was like discovering that her entire relationship with Gary had been built on lies. Every moment of jealousy she had experienced, every time Gary had reassured her that she was imagining problems that didn't exist, every instance when he had made her feel crazy for suspecting that he was capable of betrayal, all of it was suddenly revealed to be justified. But more than that, the messages revealed that Gary was capable of exploiting a child. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, the man she had shared her home and her life with was a predator who had been using their relationship as cover for criminal behavior. Dana's psychological response to this discovery was immediate and intense. The jealousy that had defined their relationship for 2 years suddenly had a focus, a target, a specific betrayal to obsess over. Every possessive instinct she had ever felt was now validated and amplified by the knowledge that Gary had actually been unfaithful in the worst possible way. While Dana was discovering the full scope of Gary's betrayal, Gary himself was finishing his shift at Thompson's Shell station, completely unaware that his secret had been exposed. He had plans for the evening that extended beyond his normal work schedule. A regular rideshare customer had requested a pickup after her shift at a local hotel, and Gary had agreed to make the trip, even though it meant staying out later than usual. It was the kind of routine decision that working people make every day, choosing to earn a few extra dollars even when they're tired and ready to go home. Gary had no way of knowing that while he was planning his evening pickup route, Dana was reading evidence of his crimes and planning a very different kind of response. Around 9:30 that evening, as Gary was preparing to leave the gas station, he received a text message from Dana. It was simple, casual, the kind of message they exchanged every day. "Hey babe," Gary responded immediately. "Hey, what's up?" But Dana didn't respond to his reply. The conversation ended as quickly as it had begun, leaving Gary with no indication that anything had changed in their relationship. He assumed Dana was just checking in, maybe wondering when he would be home from his rideshare pickup. Gary would later realize that Dana's message had been sent at exactly the time when she was discovering the truth about his relationship with Sarah. The casual tone, the normal greeting, the sudden silence, they all made sense in retrospect as the digital footprint of a woman whose world was collapsing in real time. But in the moment, Gary was focused on practical concerns. His regular customer was waiting for a pickup. He needed the money. and he had no reason to suspect that his carefully constructed double life was about to explode. Gary completed his shift, locked up the gas station, and drove to the hotel where his customer was waiting. It was a routine trip, the kind of ride he had completed hundreds of times before. They made small talk about her work, about the holiday season, about the usual topics that fill the space between strangers sharing a car ride. Gary had become skilled at compartmentalizing his various relationships and responsibilities. When he was with Dana, he focused on managing her jealousy and maintaining domestic peace. When he was with Sarah, he focused on the illicit excitement of their inappropriate relationship. When he was working, he focused on providing good customer service and earning money for his family. This psychological compartmentalization is common among people who live double lives, whether they're cheating spouses, white-collar criminals, or predators who exploit children. They develop the ability to function normally in some areas of their lives while engaging in destructive behavior in others, often convincing themselves that the different parts of their existence don't affect each other. But compartmentalization only works as long as the different parts of someone's life remain separate. When those boundaries collapse, when secrets are exposed, when the careful balance between different identities is disrupted, the psychological impact can be devastating for everyone involved. As Gary drove through the quiet streets of Millfield that evening, completing what he thought was just another rideshare trip, Dana was planning her response to his betrayal. She was moving beyond the initial shock of discovery, beyond the immediate rage of betrayal, into something more calculated and more dangerous. Dana had learned, over the course of their 2-year relationship, that Gary would tolerate almost anything in the name of keeping peace. He had accepted her jealousy, her control, her violence from family members, her destruction of his property. He had convinced himself that love required compromise, that relationships demanded sacrifice, that patience could overcome any obstacle. But Dana's discovery of Gary's crimes against Sarah had pushed her beyond the boundaries of normal relationship conflict. This wasn't something that could be resolved through argument or ultimatum. This wasn't a problem that could be solved through counseling or compromise. Dana had been betrayed in the most fundamental way possible, and her response would be equally fundamental. She was going to take from Gary something that could never be replaced, never be healed, never be forgotten. The stage was set for December 22nd, 2023. Gary would complete his rideshare trip and return home, expecting to find the same controlled chaos that had defined his domestic life for 2 years. Instead, he would walk into a situation that would change both of their lives forever. But for now, as Gary drove through the night, Dana was still planning, still calculating, still deciding exactly how to respond to a betrayal that had validated every jealous suspicion she had ever experienced and revealed that the man she loved was capable of crimes she had never imagined. The point of no return had been reached. Everything that happened after that moment would feel inevitable, as if all the psychological manipulation, all the jealousy, all the compromised boundaries and normalized abuse had been leading toward this single moment of irreversible violence. December 22nd was less than 2 hours away. December 22nd, 2023, 11:30 p.m. Gary pulled his car up to the curb outside the modest house on Maple Street, completely unaware that he was about to walk into a meticulously planned ambush. The evening had been routine, profitable even. His regular rideshare customer had tipped well, thanked him for the reliable service, wished him happy holidays. Gary was tired but satisfied, ready to come home to Dana and wind down from another long day of honest work. He had no way of knowing that while he was driving through the quiet streets of Millfield, making small talk with a hotel worker about holiday plans and weather, Dana was making final preparations for an act of violence so calculated, so brutal, that it would haunt investigators for years to come. The text message Gary had received earlier that evening, "Hey babe," had been Dana's way of confirming his location and timeline. She needed to know exactly when he would be home, needed to coordinate her plan with military precision. When Gary responded and then went silent, Dana knew he was focused on work, unaware that his secret had been discovered, unsuspecting of what awaited him. Gary climbed the familiar concrete steps to their front door, keys jingling in the night air. The house looked normal, peaceful even. Lights were on in the kitchen and living room. He could hear the television playing in the background, the comfortable sounds of domestic life that had become his routine over the past 2 years. As Gary entered the house, Dana's performance began immediately. She was sitting on their bed with her 8-year-old son, Miguel, the picture of maternal normalcy. Her 18-year-old son, Marcus, was in the kitchen with his girlfriend, Isabella, preparing late-night snacks and chatting about their plans for the next day. To Gary, it looked like any other evening in their blended family household, but Dana's calm demeanor masked a psychological state that can only be described as controlled fury. She had spent hours planning this moment, considering every detail, anticipating every variable. She knew exactly how the evening would unfold, and she was prepared to execute her plan with ruthless efficiency. Gary greeted Dana with a kiss, said hello to Miguel, settled into the routine that had defined their evenings for months. He was hungry after his long day, looking forward to the dinner Dana had mentioned earlier. She had promised him steak and rice, comfort food that would end his day on a positive note. "I'm going to grab a shower first," Gary said, noticing that Marcus and Isabella were still busy in the kitchen. "Let them finish up, then I'll eat." This small deviation from Dana's expected timeline didn't derail her plan. It actually improved it. She needed Gary clean, relaxed, unsuspecting. A shower would serve her purposes perfectly. While Gary was in the bathroom, Dana sent him a text message from the bedroom they shared. "I want to put on something special for you," she wrote. "I bought new lingerie. Let me get ready while you shower." It was the kind of romantic gesture that would have seemed sweet under normal circumstances, the sort of intimate communication that couples exchange when they're planning a special evening together. Gary, reading the message while standing under hot water, felt a moment of anticipation. Despite all the problems in their relationship, despite the jealousy and control and psychological manipulation, there were still times when he hoped they could recapture the passion that had brought them together. Gary had no way of knowing that Dana's message was actually a tactical communication designed to keep him in the bathroom longer, while she made final preparations for what was about to happen. When Gary emerged from the shower, Dana had already sent Miguel to his bedroom. The 8-year-old had protested mildly. It was late, but he was on winter break from school and didn't have to wake up early the next morning. But Dana had been firm, insisting that he needed to go to sleep immediately. She needed the house as empty as possible for what she was planning. Gary joined Dana in their bedroom, where she was waiting on the bed, already dressed in a nightgown. She seemed affectionate, normal, even playful. She touched his arm as he sat down to eat the plate of steak and rice she had prepared for him. She made conversation about his evening, asked about his rideshare customer, listened to his responses with what appeared to be genuine interest. But investigators would later recognize Dana's behavior that evening as a textbook example of predatory planning. She was managing Gary's emotional state, keeping him calm and unsuspecting while she prepared to strike. Every gesture of affection was calculated. Every moment of apparent normalcy was performance. As Gary finished his dinner, Marcus and Isabella announced that they were leaving for a while. They needed to run an errand, they said, maybe pick up some snacks from the convenience store down the street. It was the kind of casual teenage expedition that happened regularly in their household. Gary watched them leave through the front door, waving goodbye, thinking nothing of their departure. He didn't notice the meaningful look that passed between Dana and her older son. He didn't recognize that Marcus's exit was carefully timed, orchestrated to give Dana privacy for what she was planning. But Marcus didn't actually leave the house. After walking out the front door and making sure Gary saw him go, the 18-year-old circled back, entering through a side entrance where he could monitor the situation without being detected. Dana had coached him on this deception, preparing him to be a witness to what was about to unfold, while maintaining plausible deniability about his involvement. Alone now, except for Miguel sleeping in his bedroom, Gary and Dana settled into what appeared to be an intimate evening together. Gary was relaxed, well-fed, clean from his shower, looking forward to connecting with the woman he still loved, despite all their problems. Dana was entering the final phase of her plan. "Tonight is going to be special," she told Gary, her voice carrying a promise that he interpreted as romantic excitement. "Tonight we're going to have a wild night of love." Gary laughed at the phrase, surprised by Dana's unusually passionate language. She had never described their intimate moments in such dramatic terms before, but he was pleased by what seemed like renewed enthusiasm for their physical relationship. "Wild night of love?" he repeated, smiling. "That's new for you." "Why are you laughing?" Dana asked, and Gary heard a slight edge in her voice that should have warned him something was wrong. "I'm not laughing at you," Gary assured her. "I'm just surprised. "You've never talked like that before, but I like it." Dana began the intimate encounter exactly as she would any other evening, with kissing and caressing that felt completely normal to Gary. She suggested that he lie down on the bed, that she wanted to take the lead for their special night. It was a request that seemed perfectly reasonable, even exciting. Then Dana made two unusual suggestions that should have alarmed Gary if he hadn't been so thoroughly conditioned to accept her control over every aspect of their relationship. First, she wanted to turn off all the lights. They usually kept the television on during intimate moments, providing enough ambient light to see each other clearly. But tonight, Dana insisted on complete darkness. She wanted to try something different, she said. She wanted to surprise him. Second, she wanted to restrain his hands. Nothing serious, nothing that would hurt him, just a playful bondage game using a piece of her underwear to loosely tie his wrists. It would be fun, she promised. It would add excitement to their evening. Gary had never engaged in any kind of restraint play before, but Dana's suggestions seemed harmless enough. She wasn't tying him tightly. The fabric around his wrists was loose enough that he could have freed himself if he wanted to. He assumed this was just Dana experimenting with new ways to add variety to their physical relationship. With the lights off and Gary's hands loosely restrained, Dana positioned herself above him in a way that blocked his view of her movements. In the complete darkness, Gary could only feel her touches, could only respond to her caresses, could only trust that the woman he loved was leading them toward the passionate encounter she had promised. But Dana wasn't reaching for lingerie when she moved toward their dresser in the darkness. She was reaching for the weapon she had hidden there earlier in the evening, a sharp object that she had selected specifically for the irreversible damage she intended to inflict. Gary felt something unusual during what he thought were normal, intimate preliminaries, a rubber object of some kind, something that seemed like it might be related to protection or contraception. He briefly wondered if Dana wanted to use a condom, though they had never used one before. But in the darkness, unable to see what she was doing, he simply trusted her judgment and continued responding to her touches. It was a trust that would cost Gary everything. The attack, when it came, was swift and decisive. Dana had positioned herself perfectly, had chosen her moment with surgical precision. In the span of a few seconds, she used her weapon to completely sever Gary's genitalia, removing his manhood entirely in an act of violence so brutal that even experienced trauma surgeons would struggle to comprehend it. The physical damage was instantaneous and irreversible, but the psychological impact was even more devastating. In that moment of unimaginable pain and horror, Gary realized that the woman he loved, the woman he had trusted with his life, had just destroyed his identity as a man in the most literal way possible. The blood loss was immediate and massive. Gary's body went into shock, his consciousness flickering as his cardiovascular system struggled to cope with the catastrophic trauma. But even through the haze of physical agony, one terrible reality cut through everything else. Dana had planned this. She had orchestrated every detail of the evening to create this moment of complete vulnerability. The romantic dinner, the suggestion of intimacy, the darkness, the restraints, the positioning. It had all been calculated to give her the perfect opportunity to inflict maximum damage with minimum resistance. Gary tried to move, tried to understand what had happened, tried to call for help, but Dana wasn't finished. She was attempting to staunch the bleeding, not out of concern for Gary's survival, but to buy herself time to complete her plan. She pressed something against the wound, applied pressure, tried to control the hemorrhaging that threatened to kill Gary before she could finish what she had started. The entire attack had taken less than a minute, but in that minute, Dana had transformed herself from victim to perpetrator, from controlled girlfriend to calculating predator, from someone seeking justice to someone dispensing the kind of revenge that destroys everything it touches. Gary would survive the next few minutes, barely. But the man who had walked into that house expecting a normal evening with the woman he loved would never exist again. Dana had killed that version of Gary as surely as if she had put a bullet through his heart. And somewhere in the darkness of their bedroom, as Gary struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had been done to him, Dana was making sure that the evidence of her act would never be found. The part of Gary that she had severed was disappearing forever, discarded in a way that would ensure no possibility of surgical reattachment. December 22nd, 2023 had become the night when love turned to mutilation, when jealousy became literal castration. when a domestic dispute escalated into an act of violence that would leave both participants forever changed. But Gary was still conscious, still breathing, still alive to face the unimaginable reality of what the woman he loved had just done to him. The worst part wasn't over. It was just beginning. The human mind has remarkable protective mechanisms that activate during extreme trauma. Shock can delay pain, adrenaline can mask the severity of injuries, and psychological dissociation can create a buffer between consciousness and unbearable reality. For Gary, these natural defenses would prove to be both a blessing and a curse in the minutes following Dana's attack. The initial cut had been swift, but it wasn't clean. Dana's weapon, a razor blade that she had positioned precisely for maximum damage, had severed Gary's genitalia completely, but the violent motion had also created additional trauma as Gary instinctively pushed her away in his moment of realization. What should have been a single precise cut became a ragged wound that tore downward, amplifying both the physical damage and the blood loss. Gary's first coherent thought wasn't about the pain, which hadn't yet reached its full intensity. His first thought was a desperate attempt to understand what had just happened in the darkness of their bedroom. He could feel warmth spreading across his body, could sense that something catastrophic had occurred, but his brain was still struggling to process the reality of what Dana had done. "What did you do?" Gary gasped, his voice barely recognizable as his own. "What did you do to me?" Dana had rolled away from him immediately after the attack, but she hadn't dropped her weapon. In the darkness, Gary could hear her moving, could sense her presence near the bed, but he couldn't see what she was holding or what she might do next. His survival instincts kicked in immediately, overriding everything else. Gary lunged toward Dana, not to retaliate, but to control her hands, to prevent her from attacking him again. In those first crucial seconds, as blood began to pool beneath him, Gary's only thought was stopping Dana from inflicting additional injuries. He grabbed her wrists, trying to immobilize the hand that held the razor, trying to create enough distance between them to assess what had happened. It was only when Dana turned on the bedroom light that Gary saw the full scope of what she had done. The sight of his own blood, the evidence of the mutilation, the razor blade still gripped in Dana's hand. Everything hit Gary simultaneously, like a physical blow. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted with his life, had just committed an act of violence so intimate, so devastating, that it challenged every assumption he had ever made about human nature. "You betrayed me," Dana said, her voice steady despite the horror of what she had just done. "You brought that girl into our house. You betrayed me with that child." Gary stared at Dana, still not fully comprehending how she had discovered his secret, still not understanding how quickly his carefully hidden double life had collapsed into this moment of irreversible violence. The psychological shock was almost as overwhelming as the physical trauma. Dana knew about Sarah. She had planned this attack. Every romantic gesture of the evening had been calculated manipulation designed to position him for maximum vulnerability. "You didn't have to do this," Gary said, his voice breaking as the full implications of his situation began to penetrate his consciousness. "You're crazy, you're out of your mind." But Dana's response revealed that this wasn't a crime of passion, wasn't an impulsive act of jealous rage. This was calculated retribution, carefully planned and methodically executed. "You did this to yourself," she told him, holding the bloodied razor like evidence of his guilt. "You chose this when you decided to betray me." Gary's attempts to reason with Dana were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Marcus, Dana's 18-year-old son, had been waiting nearby, listening for the sounds that would indicate Dana's plan had been executed. When he heard the shouting, the commotion, the evidence of violence, he came immediately to assess the situation. Marcus entered the bedroom to find Gary bleeding profusely, Dana holding a weapon, and blood spreading across their bed and floor in quantities that indicated life-threatening trauma. For most 18-year-olds, this scene would have triggered immediate action. Calls to emergency services, attempts to provide medical assistance, basic human responses to a medical emergency. But Marcus had been prepared for this moment. Dana had coached him, had explained what she was planning, had secured his cooperation in advance. When Marcus entered that bedroom, he wasn't arriving as a neutral witness. He was arriving as an accomplice. "Hold her," Gary pleaded with Marcus, still trying to control Dana's movements, still terrified that she might attack him again. "Help me. I need to get to a hospital." Marcus positioned himself between Gary and Dana, but not to protect Gary from further harm. He was there to manage the situation according to his mother's instructions, to prevent Gary from leaving until Dana was ready to let him go. The psychological dynamic in that room was unlike anything most people could imagine. Gary, bleeding from catastrophic injuries, was pleading for help from the son of the woman who had just mutilated him. Marcus, barely an adult himself, was following his mother's instructions to control a man who was fighting for his life. Dana, having just committed one of the most violent acts imaginable, was calmly maintaining authority over the situation. Isabella, Marcus's girlfriend, appeared in the doorway moments later. Unlike Marcus, she hadn't been prepared for what she would witness. The sight of Gary's injuries, the amount of blood, the razor in Dana's hand, all of it hit her simultaneously, creating the kind of psychological trauma that would haunt her for years to come. "Call someone," Marcus told Isabella, but his instructions were vague, non-committal. He wasn't telling her to call 911, wasn't directing her to seek immediate medical assistance for Gary. He was simply creating the appearance of responsible action while following his mother's plan to control the situation. Gary, meanwhile, was beginning to understand that he wasn't going to receive help from anyone in that house. The family that had been his domestic environment for 2 years, the people he had lived with and shared meals with, and considered part of his extended support system, were now actively working to prevent him from seeking medical care. "I need my car keys," Gary said, trying to move toward his clothes, trying to gather the basic necessities he would need to save his own life. "I have to get to a hospital." But Dana had anticipated this possibility as well. She grabbed Gary's car keys and either threw them out the window or simulated throwing them, making it clear that she had no intention of allowing him to drive himself to safety. The pain was beginning to intensify now as Gary's shock wore off and his nervous system started processing the full extent of his injuries. Every movement sent waves of agony through his body. The blood loss was making him dizzy, disoriented, desperate for medical intervention that seemed to be slipping further away with each passing moment. "You want me to die here?" Gary said to Dana, the realization hitting him like another physical blow. "Or you're going to let me bleed to death?" Dana's response confirmed Gary's worst fears. This wasn't just about punishment or revenge. This was about complete destruction, about removing Gary from existence as thoroughly as possible. "Nobody is going to help you," Dana told him. "Nobody is going to touch you." Gary tried calling 911 from his own phone, but the call wouldn't connect. Whether due to technical issues, network problems, or interference from the people around him, he couldn't reach emergency services from inside the house where he was being held against his will. The desperation in Gary's voice attracted attention from outside the house. Dana's sister, Rebecca, and her family, living in the attached residence next door, could hear the commotion through the thin walls that separated their homes. They came to investigate, entering the house to find Gary hemorrhaging in their living room, while Dana controlled the situation with threats and intimidation. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. Rebecca, who had previously attacked Gary with a broom handle during a domestic dispute, was now witnessing him bleeding to death from injuries inflicted by her sister. Her husband, David, who had discovered Gary's inappropriate relationship with Sarah and had triggered this entire sequence of events, was seeing the violent consequences of his decision to inform Dana about Gary's crimes. Both of them had the power to save Gary's life. Both of them had cell phones, access to vehicles, the ability to call emergency services or transport Gary to medical facilities. Both of them were witnessing a medical emergency that required immediate intervention. But when Dana issued her command, "Nobody touches him, nobody helps him," both Rebecca and David complied. They stood in their living room, watching Gary bleed from catastrophic injuries, and chose to follow Dana's instructions rather than provide basic humanitarian assistance to someone who was dying in front of them. The psychological dynamics at work in that house go beyond simple family loyalty or fear of confrontation. What Gary was witnessing was a coordinated conspiracy to allow him to die from his injuries, a group decision to prioritize Dana's desire for complete revenge over Gary's fundamental right to medical care. Gary realized that his survival depended entirely on his own actions. Nobody in that house was going to help him. Nobody was going to call for medical assistance. Nobody was going to transport him to safety. If he wanted to live, he would have to save himself. "I'm going to die if I stay here," Gary announced, gathering what little strength he had left. "I'm walking to the emergency room." The decision to leave that house, to walk nearly a quarter mile to the nearest medical facility while bleeding from genital amputation, was perhaps the most courageous act of Gary's life. He was severely injured, losing blood with every step, wearing nothing but shorts and no shoes, walking through suburban streets in the middle of the night. But it was also his only chance of survival. Gary opened the front door and walked down the same concrete steps he had climbed just hours earlier, when he thought he was coming home to a normal evening with the woman he loved. Now he was fleeing that same house, leaving behind a relationship that had nearly cost him his life, walking toward an uncertain future that would be defined by the consequences of Dana's irreversible act of violence. The walk to the emergency room was a nightmare journey that Gary would remember for the rest of his life. Every step caused additional bleeding. Every movement sent waves of pain through his damaged body. The December air was cold against his skin, but Gary was focused only on putting one foot in front of the other, on covering the distance between Dana's house and the medical facility that represented his only hope of survival. Behind him, Gary left a trail of blood that would become evidence in the criminal case against Dana. Ahead of him lay a medical emergency that would test the limits of trauma surgery and reconstructive medicine. But in that moment, Gary was simply a man walking through the darkness, fighting for his life one step at a time. When Gary finally reached the emergency entrance of the urgent care facility, he was a sight that would haunt the medical staff for years to come. Blood-soaked, pale from blood loss, barely conscious from shock and pain, he stumbled through the automatic doors and announced to the first person he saw, "My ex-wife just cut off my penis. I need help." The nurse who first saw Gary would later describe the moment as surreal, impossible to process immediately. This wasn't the kind of injury that medical professionals expect to encounter, even in emergency medicine. The sheer brutality of what had been done to Gary, combined with the clinical challenge of treating genital amputation, created a medical crisis that pushed everyone involved beyond their normal protocols and procedures. "What happened to you?" the nurse asked, though the evidence was visible in the blood that covered Gary's body and continued to drip onto the emergency room floor. "My ex-wife attacked me," Gary repeated, using terminology that reflected his psychological break from the woman who had just tried to kill him. Dana was no longer his girlfriend, his partner, his domestic companion. She was his ex-wife, his attacker, his attempted murderer. When the emergency room physician first saw Gary's injuries, he stood frozen for several seconds, trying to process what he was witnessing. Genital amputation is among the most complex traumas that medical professionals can encounter, requiring immediate intervention to control bleeding, while also requiring specialized surgical expertise that most emergency facilities don't maintain on staff. "What do I do with this?" the doctor asked, his professional training warring with the reality of an injury that pushed the boundaries of emergency medicine. "I don't know how to handle this." Gary, despite his pain and blood loss, felt a moment of dark humor at the doctor's honest admission. If trained medical professionals didn't know how to handle his injuries, what chance did he have of surviving what Dana had done to him? But the emergency room staff quickly moved beyond their initial shock and began implementing the protocols that would save Gary's life. They photographed his injuries for medical and legal documentation. They started IV lines to replace lost blood volume. They administered morphine to manage pain that was unlike anything most people will ever experience. Most importantly, they began the process of stabilizing Gary for transport to a major medical center with the specialized surgical capabilities he would need to survive. The local urgent care facility was equipped to handle routine emergencies, but Gary's injuries required the kind of advanced trauma surgery that was only available at regional medical centers. As Gary was loaded into an ambulance for transport to Santa Casa Hospital, he was beginning to understand that survival was only the first challenge he would face. Even if doctors could save his life, even if they could control the bleeding and prevent infection, and manage the complex medical issues created by Dana's attack, Gary would still have to figure out how to rebuild an existence that had been fundamentally altered by a few seconds of violence. The man who had walked into Dana's house that evening, expecting a romantic dinner and intimate conversation, was gone forever. The man being transported to Santa Casa Hospital was someone entirely different, a victim of domestic violence, a survivor of attempted murder, someone whose identity as a man had been literally severed by the woman he had trusted with his life. But Gary was alive. Against all odds, despite the brutality of Dana's attack and the refusal of her family to provide assistance, Gary had managed to save himself. The question now was whether medical science could do anything to help him reclaim some version of the life that Dana had tried to destroy. The ambulance ride to Santa Casa Hospital became Gary's first real moment of psychological reckoning with what had happened to him. As the paramedics worked to stabilize his vital signs and manage his pain, Gary's mind began processing the implications of his injuries in ways that went far beyond the immediate medical crisis. The thermal blanket they wrapped around him provided physical warmth, but it couldn't touch the cold reality that was settling into Gary's consciousness. For the first time since Dana's attack, he had a few minutes of relative calm to think about what his life would look like now, what basic human functions he would still be able to perform, what intimate relationships might be possible in a future that had been irreversibly altered by a few seconds of violence. "I'm going to need a colostomy bag, aren't I?" Gary asked the paramedic, his voice reflecting a mix of curiosity and dread. The question revealed how little Gary understood about the specific nature of his injuries. A colostomy bag is used for waste elimination when the colon is damaged or surgically altered. Gary's injuries were entirely different, involving the complete amputation of his external genitalia. But in his state of shock and medical ignorance, Gary was grasping for any framework that might help him understand what his new reality would entail. "The doctors will explain everything when we get to the hospital," the paramedic responded, neither confirming nor denying Gary's fears, but trying to keep him calm during transport. But Gary's mind was already racing ahead to practical concerns that most people never have to consider. "How am I going to drink beer with a bag?" he asked, revealing the kind of mundane worries that surface when someone is trying to process catastrophic life changes. "You can still drink beer," the paramedic assured him, perhaps recognizing that Gary needed some reassurance that not every aspect of his life had been destroyed. "Actually, with a bag, you wouldn't have to go to the bathroom as often when you're drinking." It was a small kindness, an attempt to find something positive in Gary's situation, but it also revealed how even medical professionals were struggling to provide appropriate support for someone whose injuries were so unusual, so devastating that there were no standard protocols for addressing the psychological impact. When the ambulance arrived at Santa Casa Hospital, Gary encountered the same pattern he had experienced at the urgent care facility. Medical professionals who were trained to handle trauma found themselves confronting injuries that pushed the boundaries of their experience and expertise. The emergency room staff at Santa Casa took additional photographs of Gary's injuries, both for medical documentation and legal evidence. These images would become crucial pieces of evidence in the criminal case against Dana, but they also represented another layer of humiliation for Gary, whose most intimate trauma was being documented by strangers who were trying to help him survive. The second set of photographs showed Gary's injuries after they had been cleaned and initially treated at the urgent care facility. The wounds were more visible now, the extent of the damage more apparent to medical professionals who were trying to determine the best course of treatment. "We need to get you to surgery immediately," the urologist told Gary after examining his injuries. "This is going to require specialized reconstruction." Gary was prepared for surgery with a spinal anesthetic, a procedure that would leave him conscious but unable to feel anything below his waist. For someone who was already terrified about his medical future, the prospect of being awake during surgery added another layer of psychological stress to an already overwhelming situation. "You'll be sitting up for the injection," the anesthesiologist explained. "It's the same type of anesthetic that women receive during childbirth. You won't feel any pain." Gary barely registered the needle that would numb the lower half of his body. After everything he had endured, a spinal injection seemed like a minor discomfort, but once the anesthetic took effect and he was positioned for surgery, Gary experienced something that would haunt him for years. He was awake and alert while surgeons worked to repair the damage that Dana had inflicted. "I can feel them working," Gary told the surgical team during the procedure. "I can't feel pain, but I can feel movement, pressure, stitching." The surgical team reassured Gary that this was normal, that the sensation he was experiencing was expected with spinal anesthesia. But for Gary, lying on an operating table, while strangers repaired the most intimate part of his body, the experience was surreal and traumatic, in ways that went beyond physical discomfort. When Gary finally woke up in the recovery room around 11 o'clock the next morning, his first thought wasn't about his medical condition or his pain levels. His first concern was contacting his family, who still had no idea what had happened to him. "Where's my phone?" Gary asked the recovery room nurse. "I need to call my family." But when Gary retrieved his phone, he discovered that his trauma was far from over. While he had been fighting for his life, undergoing emergency surgery, and beginning the long process of medical recovery, Dana had been conducting a campaign of psychological warfare that extended far beyond the physical violence she had already inflicted. Dana had taken photographs of the severed body part immediately after her attack. Using Gary's own blood as a backdrop, she had documented her act of violence with the same methodical precision she had used to plan the attack itself. Then, she had shared these images with Gary's family members and friends through social media groups. The cruelty of this action is difficult to overstate. Dana hadn't simply attacked Gary, she had tried to destroy his relationships with everyone who cared about him by forcing them to witness the most intimate details of his trauma. She had turned his family and friends into involuntary participants in his humiliation, creating a network of people who would forever associate Gary with the images of violence that Dana had forced them to see. Gary's phone showed dozens of missed messages from confused and horrified friends who had been added to group chats where Dana was sharing evidence of her crime. People who had known Gary for years were suddenly confronted with graphic images of violence and accusations of infidelity that they were completely unprepared to process. "What is this group?" one friend had texted in the middle of the night. "What's going on? I'm leaving this chat." Many of Gary's contacts had immediately left the group chats that Dana had created, but not before seeing images that would haunt them permanently. Dana had managed to traumatize not just Gary, but everyone in his social network, forcing dozens of people to become unwilling witnesses to her act of revenge. Perhaps most devastatingly, Dana had used Gary's own email account to access his contacts and create these group chats. For years, Gary had allowed Dana to sync their devices for convenience, thinking it would help with their communication and coordination. He had never imagined that she would use this access to weaponize his own contact list against him. In the group chat with Gary's immediate family, Dana had shared the graphic images along with screenshots of his inappropriate conversations with Sarah. She had positioned herself as the wronged party, the victim of Gary's betrayal, the woman who had simply defended herself against a man who had violated her trust. "Gary betrayed me," Dana had written in the family group chat. "This is what he gets for being a traitor. I took his manhood because he couldn't be trusted with it." The message revealed Dana's complete lack of remorse for her actions. She wasn't apologizing for the violence she had committed. She was justifying it. She wasn't expressing concern for Gary's survival. She was celebrating his suffering. She wasn't acknowledging the brutality of her actions. She was treating them as appropriate responses to his betrayal. Gary stared at his phone in the hospital recovery room, trying to process the full scope of what Dana had done to him. The physical attack had been devastating enough, but the psychological warfare she had conducted while he was fighting for his life was perhaps even more destructive. "I need to save these conversations," Gary told his sister when he finally managed to reach her by phone. "Don't delete anything from those group chats. I'm going to need them as evidence." Gary's sister Tina was crying on the other end of the phone call, traumatized by the images she had been forced to see, horrified by the details of what had happened to her brother. "Gary, are you okay?" she asked, though the question seemed inadequate given the circumstances. "I'm alive," Gary responded, which was perhaps the only positive thing he could say about his situation. The conversations with Sarah that Dana had shared would become crucial evidence in the legal proceedings that followed. Because Gary had been meticulous about deleting incriminating messages from his own phone, Dana's decision to preserve and share these conversations actually provided prosecutors with evidence they might not have otherwise obtained. In a strange way, Dana documenting everything helped my case, Gary would later reflect. She was so focused on destroying me that she preserved evidence of what actually happened. But the preservation of evidence came at an enormous psychological cost. Gary's family and friends had been forced to witness not just the graphic results of Dana's violence, but also the details of his inappropriate relationship with Sarah. Everyone who cared about Gary now knew about his worst mistake, his criminal behavior, his betrayal of trust with a minor. The shame of having his crimes exposed to his loved ones was almost as devastating as the physical trauma he had endured. Gary had to face not just his own recovery, but the loss of respect and trust from people whose opinions mattered most to him. When investigators later asked Dana what she had done with the severed body part, her response revealed the calculated nature of her revenge. She had flushed it down the toilet, she explained, because she had researched the medical procedures for reattachment and wanted to ensure that Gary could never be restored to his original condition. "I made sure there was no way they could put it back," Dana told police during her interrogation. "I wanted him to know that this was permanent." Dana's research into reattachment procedures demonstrated that her attack hadn't been a crime of passion, but a carefully planned act of revenge designed to cause maximum irreversible damage. She had studied the famous case of Lorena Bobbitt, who had severed her husband's penis in 1993, but had thrown it into a field where police were able to recover it for surgical reattachment. Dana had learned from Bobbitt's mistake and had disposed of Gary's severed organ in a way that made recovery impossible. She wanted to ensure that Gary's damage was permanent, that he would never be able to function as a complete man again, that her revenge would follow him for the rest of his life. "Now you'll never be with another woman," Dana had told Gary during the attack, revealing that her goal wasn't just punishment for his infidelity, but complete elimination of his ability to have intimate relationships in the future. As Gary began to understand the full scope of what Dana had done to him, not just the physical attack, but the psychological warfare, the public humiliation, the destruction of evidence that might have helped his medical recovery, he realized that his survival was only the beginning of a much longer battle. He would have to rebuild not just his physical health, but his relationships with family and friends who had been traumatized by Dana's actions. He would have to face criminal charges related to his inappropriate relationship with Sarah, while simultaneously pursuing justice for the violence that had been committed against him. Most fundamentally, Gary would have to figure out how to construct a new identity as a man whose manhood had been literally severed by someone he had trusted with his life. The road ahead would be long, painful, and uncertain. But as Gary lay in his hospital bed, processing the full magnitude of what had happened to him, he made a decision that would define his recovery. He was going to survive, he was going to heal, and he was going to make sure that Dana faced consequences for what she had done. The battle for Gary's life was over. The battle for his future was just beginning. The wheels of justice began turning at exactly 2:15 p.m. on December 23, 2023, when Gary's mother walked into the Millfield Police Department and saw the woman who had nearly killed her son sitting casually in the waiting area, as if she were there to report a stolen bicycle, rather than to account for one of the most brutal domestic violence crimes in the county's history. Dana was at the police station not because she had been arrested, but because she was attempting to file a complaint against Gary's father for allegedly threatening her family during his desperate search for his missing son. It was a level of audacity that left even experienced law enforcement officers struggling to comprehend the psychology of someone who could commit such violence and then immediately try to position herself as a victim. "That's her," Gary's mother told the desk sergeant, her voice shaking with a combination of grief and rage. "That's the woman who butchered my son." The confusion on the police officer's face revealed how poorly the different shifts had communicated about the previous night's events. Dana had indeed turned herself in during the early morning hours, confessing to the attack on Gary and providing a detailed account of her actions. But due to shift changes, administrative errors, and the unusual nature of the crime, she had been released pending further investigation. It was a bureaucratic failure that would later result in disciplinary action for several officers and a complete review of domestic violence protocols. Dana should never have been allowed to leave police custody after confessing to such a serious violent crime. Her release endangered both Gary and any other potential victims, while also giving her time to destroy evidence and coordinate her defense strategy. When the detective on duty realized that Dana was sitting in his waiting room less than 24 hours after committing aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, he immediately placed her under arrest. This time there would be no administrative confusion, no shift change miscommunications, no opportunity for Dana to return home and continue manipulating the situation. "Dana Miller, you're under arrest for aggravated assault, domestic violence, and attempted murder," the detective announced, reading her rights while Gary's family watched with a mixture of relief and vindication. Dana's response to her arrest revealed the same calculated mindset that had characterized her actions throughout this entire ordeal. She didn't express remorse for what she had done to Gary. She didn't ask about his medical condition or whether he was expected to survive. She didn't acknowledge the devastating impact her actions had had on both families. Instead, Dana focused on practical concerns about her children, her job, her living situation. She wanted to know who would pick up her 8-year-old son from school. She wanted to know if she could arrange for someone to feed her pets. She wanted to know when she would be able to post bail. It was a response that chilled everyone who witnessed it, because it revealed that Dana viewed Gary's mutilation as a problem that affected her convenience, rather than a devastating crime that had nearly killed another human being. The legal proceedings that followed would take months to resolve, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Dana had confessed to the attack. She had documented her actions with photographs. She had shared evidence of her crime with dozens of people through social media. She had disposed of evidence specifically to prevent Gary's medical recovery. The prosecution had audio recordings of Dana's confession, medical records documenting the severity of Gary's injuries, witness testimony from Gary himself, and physical evidence from the crime scene. It was perhaps the most thoroughly documented domestic violence case in the county's history, but the legal system struggled with how to categorize Dana's crime. Traditional domestic violence statutes weren't designed to address genital mutilation. Assault charges seemed inadequate for the permanent, life-altering nature of Gary's injuries. Attempted murder charges were difficult to prove, since Dana could argue that she hadn't intended to kill Gary, only to injure him. Ultimately, Dana was charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, domestic violence, evidence tampering, and criminal confinement. The combined charges carried a potential sentence of up to 25 years in prison, though plea negotiations would eventually reduce that exposure significantly. Gary's own legal situation was more complicated. His inappropriate relationship with 15-year-old Sarah constituted statutory rape under California law, a felony that carried serious prison time and lifetime registration as a sex offender. The fact that Dana's violence had exposed his crimes didn't eliminate his criminal liability for exploiting a minor, but prosecutors also recognized that Gary was the victim of an extremely serious violent crime and that his cooperation would be essential for securing a conviction against Dana. They offered Gary a plea agreement that would result in probation and counseling rather than prison time, contingent on his full cooperation with Dana's prosecution and his completion of a sex offender treatment program. It was a painful reminder that even victims of terrible crimes must still face consequences for their own criminal behavior. Gary's status as a survivor of domestic violence didn't erase his responsibility for exploiting a vulnerable teenager, just as Dana's discovery of Gary's crimes didn't justify her decision to commit irreversible violence. The trial itself became a media sensation, drawing national attention to issues of domestic violence, psychological manipulation, and the criminal justice system's response to intimate partner violence. News outlets struggled with how to cover a case where the victim was also a perpetrator, where the perpetrator was also a victim of betrayal, where the circumstances were so unusual that they challenged conventional narratives about crime and punishment. Gary's testimony was the most compelling evidence against Dana, but it was also the most difficult for him to deliver. Standing in a courtroom, speaking into a microphone, Gary had to describe in clinical detail the most traumatic experience of his life. He had to relive the night of December 22nd, the moments of trust and intimacy that Dana had weaponized against him, the realization that someone he loved was capable of such calculated violence. "She told me we were going to have a wild night of love," Gary testified, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of his words. "She made me feel safe, made me trust her, and then she used that trust to destroy my life." Dana's defense team attempted to argue that their client had been driven to temporary insanity by the discovery of Gary's betrayal with her teenage niece. They painted a picture of a woman who had been psychologically pushed beyond her breaking point by a man who had violated the most sacred boundaries of their relationship. But the prosecution's evidence made clear that Dana's actions were premeditated, calculated, and designed to cause maximum irreversible damage. Her research into surgical reattachment procedures, her careful disposal of evidence, her coordination with family members to prevent Gary from receiving help, all of it demonstrated a level of planning that was inconsistent with temporary insanity. In March 2024, after a 3-week trial, Dana was convicted on all charges. The judge sentenced her to 18 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 years. It was a sentence that reflected both the severity of her crimes and her lack of remorse for the damage she had caused. The defendant planned and executed an act of violence so intimate, so devastating, that it challenges our understanding of human cruelty, Judge Patricia Hendricks said during sentencing. This was not a crime of passion. This was torture, carried out by someone who used love as a weapon and trust as a tool of destruction. Gary was present for Dana's sentencing, sitting in the front row of the courtroom as the woman who had nearly killed him was led away in handcuffs. For him, the moment represented not just justice, but the end of a chapter in his life that had begun with hope and ended with unimaginable trauma. But Gary's story didn't end with Dana's conviction. The months following the attack became a journey of physical recovery, psychological healing, and personal reconstruction that tested every assumption he had ever made about resilience, identity, and the possibility of moving forward after catastrophic loss. The medical challenges were immense. Gary underwent multiple reconstructive surgeries, each one an attempt to restore some functionality to his damaged body. The procedures were painful, expensive, and only partially successful. Gary would never be completely restored to his original condition, but doctors were able to provide him with options that allowed for basic biological functions. The psychological challenges were even more complex. Gary had to rebuild his sense of identity as a man whose masculinity had been literally severed by someone he trusted. He had to navigate relationships with family members who had been traumatized by Dana's social media campaign. He had to face his own guilt about his criminal behavior with Sarah, while also processing his victimization by Dana. Gary entered therapy immediately after his release from the hospital, working with specialists who understood both trauma recovery and sex offender rehabilitation. It was difficult, often painful work that required him to confront not just what had been done to him, but what he had done to others. I had to learn to separate my victimization from my crimes, Gary reflected months after the trial. What Dana did to me was horrible and unjustified. What I did to Sarah was also horrible and unjustified. Both things can be true at the same time. Sarah herself received extensive counseling and support services as she worked to process her own trauma from being exploited by Gary and then having that exploitation used as justification for violence. She was moved to a specialized foster care situation designed for teenagers who have been victims of sexual abuse, where she could receive the intensive therapy and support she needed to heal from her experiences. Gary's relationship with his own daughter required careful reconstruction. The 13-year-old had been exposed to graphic details about her father's crimes and victimization that no child should have to process. Family therapy sessions helped them navigate the complex emotions around trust, safety, and unconditional love that had been complicated by the events of December 22nd. Perhaps most remarkably, Gary's family rallied around him in ways that surprised everyone, including Gary himself. His parents, siblings, and extended family members chose to focus on supporting his recovery rather than condemning his mistakes. They recognized that Gary needed their love and support more than their judgment, and that healing would only be possible in an environment of acceptance and encouragement. Gary made terrible choices, his sister Tina said during a victim impact statement at Dana's trial. But terrible choices don't justify torture. Criminal behavior doesn't justify attempted murder. My brother is working to make amends for what he did wrong. Dana has shown no remorse for what she did to him. Today, more than a year after the attack, Gary has rebuilt a life that looks nothing like what he expected, but contains elements of hope, purpose, and even happiness that seemed impossible in those first dark days after December 22nd. He works as an advocate for domestic violence survivors, sharing his story to help other victims understand that healing is possible even after the most devastating trauma. Gary has also become an advocate for criminal justice reform, speaking about the need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies and more comprehensive responses to domestic violence that recognize the complex psychology of abusive relationships. People think domestic violence is simple, Gary says during his speaking engagements. They think it's just physical assault, just obvious abuse. But what I experienced was 2 years of psychological manipulation that broke down my ability to recognize danger. Dana didn't become violent overnight. She spent years preparing me to be the perfect victim. The case has become a landmark in domestic violence research, studied by psychologists and law enforcement professionals who are trying to understand how psychological manipulation can escalate to such extreme violence. Gary's willingness to share his story has contributed to training programs that help police officers and social workers recognize the warning signs of relationships that might escalate to life-threatening violence. Dana, meanwhile, remains in prison, where she has shown little interest in the rehabilitation programs available to her. According to correctional officers, she continues to maintain that her actions were justified, that Gary deserved what happened to him, that she was defending herself against a man who had betrayed her trust. Her lack of remorse has made her ineligible for early release programs and has complicated her relationships with her own children, who struggle to reconcile their love for their mother with their horror at what she did to Gary. Marcus, now 19, has distanced himself from Dana entirely, speaking publicly about the trauma of being forced to participate in his mother's campaign of violence. "I was 18 years old," Marcus said in a statement released through his attorney. "I was scared of my mother, scared of what she might do to me if I didn't cooperate, that I should have called 911. I should have helped Gary. I have to live with that for the rest of my life." The house on Maple Street where the attack occurred has been sold, the new owners unaware of the violence that took place in what is now their master bedroom. The urgent care facility where Gary first sought treatment has implemented new protocols for documenting evidence in domestic violence cases, ensuring that future victims receive both medical care and legal protection. But perhaps the most important legacy of December 22, 2023 is Gary's own transformation from victim to survivor to advocate. In choosing to share his story, to speak publicly about domestic violence and criminal behavior and the complex relationship between victimization and accountability, Gary has turned his trauma into a tool for education and prevention. "I can't change what happened to me," Gary says. "I can't undo my mistakes or Dana's crimes, but I can make sure that other people understand how these situations develop, how psychological abuse escalates, how important it is to seek help before violence occurs." Gary's story is ultimately about more than one night of extreme violence. It's about the gradual erosion of boundaries in toxic relationships. It's about the way psychological manipulation can prepare victims for physical assault. It's about the importance of recognizing warning signs before they escalate to irreversible violence. Most importantly, it's about the possibility of healing, growth, and redemption even after the most devastating trauma. Gary's life will never be what it was before December 22nd, but it has become something else, a testament to human resilience, a call for better understanding of domestic violence, and proof that even the most broken people can rebuild themselves into something stronger than they were before. As investigators who have studied this case extensively, we've learned that the most dangerous domestic violence situations often involve psychological manipulation that escalates gradually over months or years. Gary's experience demonstrates how abusers systematically break down their victims' defenses, creating conditions where extreme violence becomes possible. But Gary's recovery also demonstrates that healing is possible, that victims can reclaim their lives, and that even the most terrible experiences can be transformed into forces for positive change in the world. The case of Gary Thompson and Dana Miller will be studied for years to come, not just as an example of extreme domestic violence, but as a complex examination of human psychology, criminal behavior, and the long journey from victimization to recovery. It's a story that challenges our assumptions about crime and punishment, about victims and perpetrators, about the possibility of redemption and the power of resilience. But most of all, it's Gary's story. And he's still writing it, one day at a time, one speaking engagement at a time, one conversation with another survivor at a time. December 22nd, 2023 was the worst night of Gary's life, but it wasn't the end of his story. In many ways, it was just the beginning.